And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute. Now, um, I'm going to throw a feeler out there. And here's what I mean by that it's a feeler and it's a teaser. All right? I'm kinda thinking about beginning to do a live blog on Wednesday evenings. I'm only thinking about it at this point. And it would be a live call in, kind of like the Patreon type of thingy, in which you could ask your biblical questions. And it's not going to be a free for all. Not going down that road. I will probably pick a subject and give a little 10-minute synopsis, 15-minute, 20-minute synopsis of what I'm thinking on that particular subject on that particular evening, and then your questions would have to be related to the subject. Not going to have any call-ins. What do you think about all the black helicopter dudes out there? Yeah. Have you ever had those men in black show up at your door? No, not going to have that. Okay. Just be warned. If I do this, I would like to have your response to this idea. All right. It's not like I need something else to do. Somebody asked me just recently, they said, "Hey, Don, what's it like to be retired?" I was stunned. I said, "Excuse me?" They said, "Well, you are retired, aren't you?" I said, "Dude, I'm working harder now than I ever have in my life." Literally. I mean, I'm at my office where I am now, generally speaking, about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I work until, about 8:15. Process book orders, go to the post office, come back and go to work again. And I can tell you this, I'm actually filming this on Saturday evening after my Razorbacks lost their game against Texas A&M. But that's another story, so I won't go into it. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I am at my office 24, 10 days a week, basically. There's hardly a day ever that I'm not at my office unless I happen to be out of town. So that's what I told this individual. I said, "I'm working harder than I ever have." And I said, "Furthermore, I'm having an absolute ball." I love what I'm doing, having a wonderful time. I love videoing. I love sharing my thoughts with you. I love even exchanging comments with those who disagree, as long as those are respectful, as long as there's some honest dialogue and not throwing up clouds of smoke and dust and obfuscation and what have you, which I get a lot of, but nonetheless. So just a little, I'm just tossing this out there. Give me your feedback about the idea. Okay? Again, my idea is just kind of floating around out here, is to do this on Wednesday evenings. I don't know what time yet if I do it. And once again, I will probably give a 15 or 20 minute, maybe 20 minutes, maybe even 25, just a little thumbnail sketch of my thoughts that evening. And then open it up for questions. And you can submit your questions, and there we go. All right? I think it could be a lot of fun if it's done with respect, if it's done with decorum. And believe you me, I don't have to answer your questions or even address your questions if you go off the rails. Okay? You got that? Believe you me, I'm in charge of the delete button here. Yeah, I really am. Okay, so all of that said, let me hear from you. I really want to know what you think about this. If you think it would be helpful for you, and if you have suggestions for topics for me to introduce and give a little synopsis and then open it up Q&A, yeah, send it in. I won't guarantee you that I will address the subject that you recommend, but hey, I might. It's my show. Okay, now then, let's get back to what we spoke about yesterday, Sukkot as the joy of the nations. Very quick rehearsal here. The Jews call Sukkot the joy of the nations because during the 7 days of Sukkot, over 70 bulls were sacrificed on behalf of all of the nations, represented symbolically by the number 70. Now again, some take that to represent the 70 nations enumerated in Genesis 5 and following. Others say, well, the Jews realized that there might be nations that they didn't even know about. And thus the 70, being a twofold multiplication of perfect numbers, would represent symbolically any nation and all nation outside of Israel. You see, Sukkot was not just strictly about Israel. Did it concern Israel? Well, it certainly did, because it celebrated, recollected, memorialized Israel's dwelling, in tents in the wilderness and how God was with them. God dwelt with them. And so, as each individual and as the nation built their sukkahs, most generally on the rooftops. And if Jerusalem was completely full, if every rooftop was full, then they built them outside the walls, and they built them in the territory surrounding Jerusalem itself. Can you imagine the scene? Mount of Olives, and all of the land all the way to Bethel, just full of these sukkahs, these tents, these lean-tos, these tabernacles. It must have been absolutely incredible. Okay, so the point being that in addition to a celebration and in addition to a memorial of God being with them in the wilderness wandering, these 70 sacrifices were intended for the benefit of all possible nations. Now, let's remember what all of the feast days were. Those feast days were convocations. A convocation was a rehearsal. And the book of Colossians and the book of Hebrews tells us they were shadows of the good things about to come. Hebrews 9 and 10 tells us that sacrificial cultic system was imposed until the time of Reformation. Well, that word Reformation is extremely critical, ladies and gentlemen. The word Reformation is used in non-biblical text. It's used in text about injustice in society. It is used about financial perversity and corruption. It is used in medical text. And in all of these non-biblical texts, it means, for instance, if you got a broken bone, okay, and it's out of kilter, it's broken. Deorthosis meant you set it back where it's supposed to be. It's putting things right. If you have a social injustice, then guess what? That social injustice is made right. It's corrected. If it's graft and corruption, guess what? It's punished and it's terminated. The point being that Hebrews is very emphatic that those feast days were only temporary. And as I've shared with you many times before, in describing the praxis of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, in Hebrews chapter 9, and the high priest offering the sacrifice, entering into the most holy place and coming out again to declare salvation, the writer then says, for. In other words, he gives the reason for Christ's second coming. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, about to come literally, and not the image of those things, can never, by those sacrifices which they make year by year continually. For if the first worshippers were once purged, then there would be no more sacrifice for sin. Do you get the point? The writer's point is all of the sacrifices of the Old Covenant, and in this specific text, it's Yom Kippur, but it certainly has to do with the other sacrifices, because guess what? Sukkot was to make atonement for the nations, as I read to you from some of the rabbinic writings. Atonement for the nations, for their benefit, for peace. No trouble, no war. Okay? Okay, so here's the point. Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, was a shadow of something that was yet to come. It was not the expression of what was to come. It was a shadow, a prefiguring, a forecast, a prophecy, a rehearsal of the good things that in Colossians and in Hebrews were, quote, about to come, unquote. Now, keep in mind that Hebrews 9, as well as Hebrews chapter 10, 1 and 2, tells us that if those sacrifices of those feast days had been effective in obtaining atonement, if the worshiper would have been actually purged in regard to his conscience, no longer had any consciousness or remembrance of sin, guess what? The sacrifices would have ceased. Now then, yesterday I asked the question, since in Zechariah chapter 14, after the day of the Lord, against Jerusalem, the day of the Lord with his coming with all of his saints, all of the nations of the earth, all of the nations that had come up against Jerusalem at the day of the Lord. By the way, doesn't that tell us what the day of the Lord is? It's not an earth-burning, time-ending event. It was the day of the Lord in which nations came in warfare against Jerusalem. That's how the day of the Lord is defined. That really helps us deal with atheists, ladies and gentlemen. It really helps us to deal with those people who say, no, the day of the Lord, that's a time-ending, cosmos-destroying event. No, the day of the Lord was a time of warfare, active warfare in which the nations came up to destroy Jerusalem. That was the day of the Lord. But I digress. Okay, so the writer tells us, after that day of the Lord, all of the nations which came up against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, some of my Sabbatarian friends say, see, we're going to have the reinstitution of the Feast of Tabernacles. And of course, they tell us the Sabbath will never end. Well, wait a minute. Paul is clear in Colossians. The writer of Hebrews is clear in Hebrews that if those sacrifices, by the way, that included the Sabbath sacrifices, it included Sukkot, if those sacrifices would have made anyone perfect, then those sacrifices, thus the observance of Sukkot, the observance of Yom Kippur, would have ceased to be honored, would have ceased to be offered. In other words, the feast would not be observed. Why? Because that which they pointed to, that which they prophesied, that which they foreshadowed, that which they rehearsed, had now become a reality. When the reality would come, the shadow would end. So unless you're willing to say that Paul was wrong in Colossians, that Hebrews was wrong in the book of Hebrews, that when that which those things pointed came at the time of the Reformation, that those things would cease. And unless you're willing to say that that's false, then you cannot argue that in Zechariah chapter 14, 8 and following, or 16 and 17, excuse me, you can't argue that the literal feast of Yom Kippur or Sabbath or Sukkot would literally, physically be observed. Because once again, they were shadows of the good things that were about to come. The good things was the time of Reformation. When the time of Reformation came, the feast days would end. And by the way, don't you think it ironic that in the Sabbatarian world, it is commonly taught that, well, Jesus took the ceremonial feast days, and that would have involved Yom Kippur, that would have involved Sukkot, that would have involved Yom Teruah, that is the Day of Trumpets, Feast of Trumpets. That's all of those feasts. And a traditional argument in the Sabbatarian camp is, guess what? At the coming of the Lord, at the cross, Jesus nailed all of those ceremonial feast days to the cross. They came to an end. Well, that's diametrically opposed to what Paul said. Because Paul in Colossians 2, 16 and 17 used the present active indicative when he speaks of the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths. And make no mistake, Sukkot was a Sabbath. Yom Kippur was a Sabbath. Yom Teruah was a Sabbath. And Paul said all of those Sabbaths were, and he uses the plural form, shadows of the good things that were about to come. Well, since those good things, i.e. the time of Reformation, was about to come, that means those feast days, including Sukkot, was about to end. Folks, you do realize there has not been a temple observance of Sukkot for 2,000 years. You do realize that, don't you? I'm out of time. We'll pick up and summarize what we have seen in regard to Sukkot being the joy of the nations on the flip side. See you there.